Hello, welcome, ladies and gentlemen, speakers, participants, to the second session of the 31st Chatham House Global Forum on Forest Governance 2021. My name is Damayanti from Bogor Agricultural University, Indonesia. The second session, the theme for the second session is the vision on 2030 and how this can be achieved. As we all know, the UN Strategic Plan for Forest 2030 calls for a world where forests are sustainably managed, contribute to sustainable development, and provide economic, social, environmental, and cultural benefits for present and future generations. So a critical question is thus, how are we going to achieve this? Especially in this time of pandemic, where maybe the foundations of the very foundations of life has changed because of pandemic. So these are very important times for us to look back and to think about 2030 and how we are going to achieve the vision of 2030. So today we are going to listen to 4 keynote speakers who I will introduce in a while. Before that, I would like to convey some information that we should know on how the session is going to be conducted. So allow me to start with this information. So first of all, there will be a 5-minute presentation from the keynote speakers. There are 4 panelists, as I said earlier. And then these panelists, they will outline their vision for the development models that will enable the sustainable and equitable use of forest and what will be required to achieve this. Then there will be about 30 to 40 minutes question panel discussion, depending on how long the keynote speeches are being conducted. And after that, there will be about 30 minutes for the question from the audience. There is a chat box and also a question answer box. So we would be very happy if you can ask your question in the question and answer box so that I can call you when the session for the audience has come up. There is also a 5 language, so you can choose which language you want to use. So there's English, Spanish, Indonesia, Portuguese, and French. This session is recorded, so we all know that what we say will be recorded and it will be sent out, I think, also, and it will be distributed later on. For the keynote speakers, 5 minutes, and of course I will allow 1 minute beyond the 5 minutes, but please, after that, maybe I need to remind you. Okay, so let us start with the introduction of the panelists. I will first introduce David Kaimowitz, who is a manager of the Forest and Farm Facility from FAO. David Kamowitz manages the FFF. It's a partnership between FAO, IUCN, IIED, and AgriCord, and he is based in Rome. He brings to the position extensive experiences as a manager, rural policy analyst, grant maker, communication strategist, fundraiser, including work with diverse forest and farm producer organizations and other grassroots rural groups. Prior to FFF, he served as a senior advisor to CLUA and also senior consultant to the Latin American Regional Office of FAO. And he was also the DG at C4 Indonesia, and many other international positions. So it's an honor to have David Kamowitz here. Good afternoon, I think it's in Rome. Good afternoon, David.
Good afternoon, Dami.
Okay, and the second speaker is a very old friend, Nonette Royo, who is the executive director of Land Tenure Facility. She is a lawyer, practitioner, and a specialist in indigenous peoples, land rights as human rights, environment, and natural resource management. Most of Nonette's work has been in Southeast Asia and Pacific, and her work in Indonesia, Philippines, and Southeast Asia and Melanesia has spanned over more than 30 years. The regions of her work to support indigenous people and local communities now has expanded to Latin America and Africa, as she is now the executive director of Tenure Facility. Hello, Nonette. Nice to see you again.
Nice to see you, Dami. Good afternoon. Thank you.
And our third speaker is Carlos Manuel Rodríguez. He is the CEO of the Global Environment Forum, lawyer by profession, politician by choice, and conservationist at heart. Beautiful. Carlos Manuel Rodríguez was elected as CEO and chairperson of the GEF by its governing body in June 2020. He was a former Costa Rican environment and energy minister. He was a pioneer in the development of payment for ecosystem services, initiative and strategies for forest restoration, ocean conservation, and decarbonization, and is an internationally recognized expert on environmental policy, multilateral environmental negotiation, and financing for nature conservation. Hello, Carlos. It's nice to
good morning.
have you here.
Greetings from Costa Rica.
Good morning. A very beautiful view of Costa Rica behind.
Thank you. Good morning.
And our last speaker is Rene Ngongo. He is the founder and also the vice president of the Congolese Organization of Ecologists and Friends of Nature, OCEAN. Hello, Rene. Welcome to the session. Rene is a Congolese national who holds a degree in biology from the University of Kisangani. He then followed several trainings, both in country and in France, on the sustainable management of natural resource certification and also sustainable management of forest, conservation of biodiversity, mitigation of the environmental and social impacts of the extractive sector. He was previously a teacher and researcher at the Department of Ecology and Nature Conservation, Faculty of Science at the University of Kisangani until 2004, and he now devoted himself entirely to the NGO OCEAN. So welcome, Rene. So with that introduction, allow me to present David Kamowitz with the 5-minute or 6-minute keynote speech. David.
Thank you. And hello to everybody. It's such a pleasure to be here with such distinguished panelists and to have the opportunity to share some thoughts with the audience. They asked me about what is my vision for a sustainable and equitable use of forests for 2030 and how to get there. And that vision depends fundamentally on well-functioning organizations of 4 types: governments, companies, experts, which may be NGOs or maybe academics, and grassroots organizations like indigenous peoples and local community organizations, farmers organizations, community organizations, and the members that they serve. Like a table, we need all 4 of those legs to get to the forest future that we're looking for. And if any of those 4 legs are missing, that table is going to wobble and wobble really poorly. The grassroots groups are especially important in that mix for 2 reasons. First, because of the incredible magnitude of their weight or their presence on the landscape. Somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of all the land, depending on the sources and your definitions, is managed collectively, communally in one way or another by traditional communities. An even larger percentage of the forest and the well-intact forest is managed by these communities. If we think about biodiversity, if we think about carbon, we're not talking about one more sector, we're talking about an essential central group. And if we think about forest restoration, it's hard to imagine forest restoration in most of Africa, Asia, or Latin America without a central role for farmers. And in terms of characteristics, we're talking about organizations that are much closer to the ground, that are going to be there after the next project cycle ends or the next government changes, that have incredible ecological traditional knowledge, and that have a solid track record of managing their forests and ecosystems well. Given these characteristics, you would think that this sector of grassroots organizations and community groups would be front and center, that would be simply a no-brainer, as they say in English. But the reality is that they're often completely left to one side or pushed into a box called safeguards, rather than being central actors at the table. I've been involved in a number of RED processes, climate change processes for the World Bank and others, where indigenous people manage 40% of the forests, but in the discussions, it seemed like they were a footnote. Currently, we're involved in discussions about cocoa and sustainable use of cocoa and deforestation in countries like Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire. And we have the governments, NGOs, companies all lined up at the table and no invitation sent to farmer organizations. If we think about the money that goes to these organizations, it's absolutely tiny. IIED has told us that less than 10% of climate finance is getting to any sort of local group, much less grassroots organizations. And Rainforest Foundation Norway just did a study that says only $270 million a year get to all of the indigenous peoples and local community groups all around the world. These groups need better support, they need more support, and they need it urgently because the threats to their forests, to their ecosystems, to their lives are increasing every day. They need money for the tenure work that Nonette's going to be talking to you about, for governance, livelihoods, for participation. They need a policy enabling framework that makes them be full participants in the process. And we need capacity building, but capacity building that builds their self-reliance, not their dependence. That's going to require very new approaches because organizations like the FAO or the GEF or FCDO aren't designed to provide funds to these grassroots organizations. As my friend and colleague Penny Davis always says, they don't have the right plumbing. They're talking past each other, their procedures, their policies, our procedures, our policies are not designed to get the sort of support that grassroots organizations need on the ground. We don't want to turn these grassroots organizations into another set of consultants and NGOs, because if we do, they will lose their legitimacy. They will lose the very strength that make them so powerful in the work they do. So if I have one message today to this group, it's we need greater and a new type of support for grassroots organizations, indigenous peoples, local communities, farm organizations, and it's urgent that we find it. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Thank you so much for your insight. I'm sure there will be lots of questions for David. So for the audiences, if you would like to ask a question, please write in the question and answer box. Our next speaker is Nonette Royo. The 5 minutes is yours.
Thank you, Dami. I would like to really acknowledge and be present with my co-panelists and the chair and the many peoples and organizations watching this webinar. Good afternoon. To be here, I am very pleased, especially to speak, to share our vision based on what I have learned over the years, working directly with Indigenous peoples and local communities, and from what the Tenure facility has advanced over the last 5 years since its launch in trying to find solutions to protecting our forests through land tenure. I will first start by recognizing how important this juncture is really in the last 30 years, seeing governments coming together as an international community of nations committing really to the agreement, the Paris Agreement, and particularly to this one goal, that is to adapt, to protect communities and natural habitats. To protect communities means for us to partner with them as forest guardians. Partnerships are clearer with clear land tenure. It is our vision to share here of a development model that will enable the sustainable and equitable use of forests. And to complement David, research has shown us that almost 20% of the world's forest carbon is held in Indigenous people's land, and deforestation is 20 times lower in forest lands where Indigenous and local community tenure is recognized and enforced. I will focus on the questions that straddle investment, funding, and equity, as those are most relevant from our experience. So the two questions really that in this panel are, just to recap, do international organizations need a radical change in funding strategies if the required transition is to be achieved? And what are some of these challenges for forest governance efforts by Indigenous peoples and local communities and small farmers? So my answer, yes. Radical change is in funding land tenure. Land tenure for Indigenous peoples and local communities is one of the most important aspects of what we are learning is a multi-pronged strategy, that is to get good forest governance. The others being good incentives. I think one of our co-panelists here will talk about that, and good and responsive forest monitoring and enforcement by governments, working with Indigenous peoples and local communities. Radical in that it needs serious focus and larger direct funding and investments to local and Indigenous peoples organizations or their trusted allies in civil society, where these funds are not buried under climate or biodiversity or law enforcement, justice programs and projects. Tenure facility approach in supporting land tenure work is in finding this nexus of countries' existing effective legal frameworks and opportunities and existing strong, credible Indigenous and local organizations who themselves make the strategic choice to engage government at their levels of comfort and to implement these laws, constitutional policies, to gain and advance rights recognition with local local governments and other partners. And our partners have worked hard over the last 5 years to advance their tenure to 14 million hectares now and poised to benefit a lot of people, 7 million, and at least 12 countries. That is the estimate so far, and that's been our monitoring results. Some challenges come with this, as in my answer to the question, because it requires a lot of work and time to conduct credible, trusted social mobilization and to generate the technical expertise in community-led and community-trusted ground truthing, boundary setting, demarcation. This involves conflict resolution right straight away, sometimes, and verification, negotiations, registration, and recognition. That's a long process. And it means that the plumbing, as David mentioned, or the flow of funding for tenure must be diverse, long-term, and must know how to respect and trust the Indigenous peoples and local community processes of decision-making and accountability and cycles and seasons. And this will require really the building of capacity to manage and administer and report these funds in their systems as they integrate and as trust improves. So if these are addressed, many systems on regulatory issues will resolve on the ground conflict, and dialogue is easier to handle. And just lastly, one point on equity and inclusion. The governments are faced this balancing challenge of involving all local and indigenous women, their groups, their organizations in tenure and land use priority setting. We're seeing in land tenure discussions how integrating this in women's priorities and land use is becoming very important in adaptive ways of governing forests. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Nonette. Our next speaker will be Carlos. And again, I remind everyone who wants to ask questions, please do so in the question and answer box. Carlos.
Thank you so much, dear colleagues and friends. Greetings from Costa Rica. Quite an honor and a pleasure to be here. Let me begin by doing a statement. I've been reading and hearing for 45 years that now, in the next 5 years, in the next 10 years, in the next 5 years, we'll finally crack down on how to do sustainable forest management. And evidence has told us that we haven't learned it. For me, particularly tropical primary forests are too precious to continue messing around on them without recognizing that without primary forests, we will never achieve our 30% biodiversity related goals, our 1.5% climate goals, our adaptation goals, and most importantly, the 2030 agenda. So I come from a country that when I was 10 years old, the World Bank told us that Costa Rica has the highest rate of deforestation per capita. And during my lifespan, I'm 61 right now, Costa Rica was able to stop deforestation, double the size of the forest at the same time that the population doubled and the economy tripled. But it was very clear to us in Costa Rica that we can protect nature and that will not threaten our social and economic agendas. On the contrary, today we connect much better the dots within our natural capital and growth, prosperity, and inclusion, social inclusion more than ever. So there are ways by which you can do that. Let me share the 4 things that I strongly believe that help us in Costa Rica, and that those things are not that different anywhere else in the planet. I mean, you can think on boreal forests, you can think on temperate forests, tropical forests, dry lands, and my 4 recommendations will be basically the same. First, I won't go on this one because Nonette just mentioned, it is extremely important that once and for all we deal the rights issue, not just on land title, but on rights. And here I'm talking also on carbon rights, environmental services rights, and yes, of course, land tenure. When Costa Rica decided in the 50s, 60s, and 70s that the government was a very bad steward of nature and the land, and began assigning land, giving land to the landless, and yes, some of them can see this as pure capitalism, privatizing the land, or others see this as a social approach, giving land to the landless. Nevertheless, people, communities, farmers communities, and indigenous communities prove that they were better stewards than governments in protecting and in restoring. And I won't go much on this because we've got the tenure facility and many other experts, but we need to deal this one. We need to solve it once and for all. Without that, anything else will never work. So the rights issue, land tenure. And let me say, yes, in the paper, we see a lot of rights. On the ground, those rights are not fully respected. Not just with farmers and indigenous communities, but the same thing happened with protected areas. 2/3 of protected areas in developing countries are just paper parks. There are no rangers, no management plan, no budgets, no nothing. So that's a big issue. My second point is the market failure. We keep on, now today we all recognize that there's a market failure that doesn't recognize the benefit and the value of the environmental services being provided by tropical forests, indigenous territories, protected areas, and we need to be able to address that market failure. Otherwise, the people will continue promoting land use change. The rich and the poor will continue promoting land use change because there is no other option. If keeping the forest is not an option for a small community deep in the Congo Basin, or to a large company in the Cerrado in Brazil, they will, legally or illegally do a land use change. We need to pay them at the national and international level for the environmental, and I'm not talking carbon, I'm talking about environmental services, water, landscape beauty, biodiversity, and yes, of course, carbon. We need to pay them at least the cost of opportunity of the things that we don't want to see in those landscapes. We don't want to see large monocultures. We don't want to see large inefficient cattle ranching happening in those pristine landscape. Well, let's pay those owners, those who live there, for the environmental services that they provide us with. And yes, of course, REDD+ has been there for 15 years. I think that REDD+ has been a big failure because we haven't understand how to address the market failure to REDD+, and it is not just through a market system, rather than understanding the institutional failure, which is my third point that I will be getting there in just a second. So we need to pay owners of forests for the cost of opportunity of doing the things that we don't want to see in those landscapes. In Costa Rica, we began in 1997, paying $42 per hectare per year to those who live in the landscapes for keeping their forests, because that was the cost of opportunity of doing cattle ranching. So when we began paying them that amount of money for their carbon services, the reaction of people in the landscapes on the ground was very positive, and we began restoring and protecting forests in Costa Rica. Of course, you cannot match the cost of opportunity of doing sustainable management of timber. You cannot match the cost of opportunity of doing cattle, coffee and other agricultural. But those activities are right if they are done with best practices in the right soils. So you can generate through the carbon, through the market failure, not just a good incentive, but also a good land use system. But today, they are paying $5 per ton of carbon. That is unacceptable. In any way you may see it, it is even an insult to any community or any country to be paid $5 per ton. And that is the big, huge market failure that I see. I don't understand why a ton of carbon from the Cayapo community in Mato Grosso, the value is $5, and a ton of carbon being offset in a cement plant in Switzerland, the value is $80 per ton. So we got a big, big issue to solve there. The third point, the institutional
Your
failure.
time is almost up, 30 seconds more.
Let me just finish a couple of minutes and I'll finish here. The institutional failure, we will never achieve any sustainability goal if we keep on working from the government perspective on sectors. Agriculture and environment continues to be the big clash, and I'm so happy that David is in FAO helping us dealing with that. And at the institution and internally within the environmental agency, we still have the forester and biologist conflict. They don't come around, they don't understand themselves. So we got agriculture and environment, you got the forester and the biologists continue to have that confrontation that I have been seeing for 50 years. My final point here, not less important than the three previous one, is it's good governance and corruption. Corruption continues to be to me the biggest threatening sustainable management of landscapes and natural resources. Transparency and accountability should be in the center of all. Environmental rule of law should be in the center of all. And equity and inclusion are elements that are not even near the discussion on forest conservation. So those are the things that I strongly believe that we need to work in order to be on track for the 1.5%, on track for the positive nature post 2030, and being able to achieve the SDG goals. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you so much, Carlos. Let us go straight to Rene Ngongo, our last speaker. the time is yours.
Merci beaucoup. Ça a été un
Thank
plaisir.
you very much. Such a pleasure for me to be here with the other panelists who have said many similar things to what are happening in my country, the Democratic Republic of Congo. We have 150 million hectares of forest, and a sizable part of the population also depends directly on the forest. And currently, with the decrease, at the moment, these forests are currently being threatened. This is due to agriculture, as the previous speaker just said. There is a lot of slash and burn that has caused a lot of damage. The access to energy means that the country uses wood as a source of energy, and this creates a lot of damage in the forests. And beyond that, there is a lot of pressure from multinational countries as it relates to logging indirectly, but a lot of requests for plantations in forests, as is the case in other countries. We saw the example of Indonesia, but also Brazil. These threats are real threats. And today, we still have a moratorium which prevents this type of land conversion. But I would just like to inform you that the interpreter apologizes. The interpreter apologizes. We're experiencing some issues with the speaker's connection.
Okay, I think we may have some connection problem. Okay. Rene, I'm sorry, we cannot hear you quite well. Okay. I think there's some connection problem with Rene, so let us just go straight to the question answer session, or the panel discussion itself. So for the next 30 minutes, we will go into the panel discussion, and then the next 30 minutes after that, the question answer session. And when Rene joins, he will go directly to the panel discussion with us. Okay, so let us start. Thank you so much to David, Carlos, and also Nonette. Such inspiring speech, and it makes me just wonder. You've covered everything, and Carlos, especially, you mentioned about corruption, and I think that's the major, how should I say this? Major challenges that many countries are facing is corruption. So when we listen to David, you mentioned that we need a greater and new type of support. And Nonette said, radical change. Wonderful, radical change. And long-term funding. Carlos mentioned a lot about that many parks are actually just paper parks. And no budget, there's market failure. And so listening to these speakers, I would like to start actually with Carlos, because what Costa Rica has experienced. You mentioned that before, lots of deforestation, and then afterwards, we all see now how you have achieved so much in your country. So if I can start with you, what actually changed in Costa Rica if we are using this radical change that Nonette mentioned, and also we need innovation and greater new type of support that David also mentioned. Did you do that in Costa Rica? Is there something in the experience of the Costa Rica that you think can be brought up to the international level? Because I know that there's a lot of locality uniqueness that maybe cannot be brought up into the international level. But at this moment and time, if you look at what's happening in the world, is there something that you think we can learn from you? Carlos.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the question. if we can perceive as a radical investment, investing in education and the social needs of the people, well, this is what we did in Costa Rica. We've been systematically investing in education and in good governance ever since. When my grandfather was born in 1906, Costa Rica was the poorest nation in the Western Hemisphere. And today, a Costa Rican lives happier, longer, with a smaller environmental footprint that many developed industrialized nations. But that is due to the very consistent long-term vision on education and healthcare. That gave us the possibilities to really bring nature conservation as an added element in terms of values and principles into my society, which was struggling because we destroyed most of our landscapes and we were feeling the social and economic impact of losing our natural capital. So those elements were crucial. The other element, which came much, much later, is that we went from perverse incentives into positive ones. If you own a forest, you were taxed because you were not producing. You were not generating jobs. So we understood the market failure and began addressing the market failure. We didn't wait for REDD+ to be a global financial mechanism. We put a tax on fossil fuels to pay people for the environmental services they provide us with in 1997. Costa Rica was the first tropical country with a carbon tax, and we use it to do payments to people. And when people are being paid for keeping the forest and restoring the landscape, and that payments is higher than the option, number one option, which was subsistence agriculture or cattle ranching in marginal soils, they choose for that. And yes, of course, tourism, a very strong system of protected areas work very well. And then, of course, a good, great enabling condition is the democratic systems, strong institutions, and the need to adjust institutions. You introduced myself as the former Minister of Environment and Energy. The minister in Costa Rica is a Minister of Environment, Energy, Water, the oceans, nature conservation, and mining. We don't make a difference within renewable and non-renewable natural resources, which is kind of the perfect storm for the conflict within agencies managing natural resources in the same landscapes. We avoid that. We understood that we will never achieve our conservation goals with the same institutional framework that in first place created the problem that we want to solve today. So adjusting our institutions. And also, yes, of course, we've been very good in using the best available technology to monitor land use change, and use the judicial system and trust on the environmental rule of law to prosecute people. So it's a mixture of market and it's a mixture of a carrot and the stick. And yes, of course, ecotourism helped a lot, but also it was, a big investment that the country has done. I see many countries already working in those same areas as we did in Costa Rica.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Carlos. Rene, I would like to invite you to continue finishing your statement if you're available. Is your internet connection better now? Rene? Yes, please do.
Oui, j'espère que vous me suivez.
Yes.
I hope you can hear me now.
Yes, I can hear you very well. Please continue.
Merci beaucoup. Je disais que, effectivement,
I was saying that the country is faced with many pressures, pressures from multinational companies who want to go from conversions and plantation forests. But along the years, we have seen several initiatives aiming at reducing deforestation, and they are taking shape. And we have the REDD mechanism that has been set up to reduce emissions. However, as my colleagues have said, this process did not reach the results it wanted. So it is important that we take all of the factors into account, and we didn't take into account local and indigenous peoples' factors. Many people are funded through these initiatives, but these are focused on on a handful of workshops and not to the communities. And these communities need fund to face poverty. And the poverty problem is, of course, a great threat for the Congo Basin forest. In terms of alternatives, we have developed what we call local community forests to help local communities to leverage these initiatives. And there are questions linked to the respectful use of these communities. And in the Congo Basin, especially in the DRC, we really must focus on indigenous people's rights. For 20 years, we thought that the reform and the new forest law would initiate development in this area. However, if you go to logging areas, we can see that the opposite is true. Communities do not have any livelihood rights because the forests are used for other uses, and we have pharmacies, we have supermarkets being built, and they completely destroy the areas. As I was saying at first, we must strengthen sustainable development by including local communities and indigenous people and pygmy people, because they have shown us many times that they have the capacities to sustainably manage their forests and for the future generations. But when we're talking about the administration also, one of the main problems, and maybe I can come back to it later, but we must strengthen administration's capacity so that there is a real control and audit. And this, to me, is one of the blockages that still remains when we talk about sustainable management. I know that some of these issues have already been tackled by my colleagues. I know I've only got 5 minutes, so I would rather answer the questions and come back in a little bit. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Rene. So yes, agree with you. So let us continue the questions. I think I would like to go to David for this last, the next question. It's on the government itself. We've heard, I think all of you have stressed how important it is the indigenous community, local community, etc. Let us talk about the role of the government now. What do you think should be the priorities for reform for national government to help achieve a transition to sustainable use of the forest and land? David.
I mean, I think the number one priority is the area that Nonette is working in, which is formal recognition of the territorial rights of indigenous peoples and traditional communities, which can take one of many different forms depending on the country and the regional context. And as Carlos Manuel said, it's not just about a title, it's also about clarifying rights over the forest, access to forest, benefits to forests, what people can do, what they can't do, but clarifying and strengthening the rights and accompanying in a positive way these traditional communities around the world. The second thing that communities, the governments can do, and I think there are some very interesting examples out there, and Costa Rica is one of them, and Latin America has moved faster than either Africa or Asia for the most part, is communal payments for environmental services. Not payments for environmental services like Carlos Manuel was saying, on the logic of simply paying the opportunity cost of a landowner to not destroy the forest, but rather payments to communities in Mexico, in Costa Rica, in Peru, in Ecuador, where the payments are being used to strengthen those communities, their social cohesion, their ability to manage and guard and govern their forests, their ability to keep out outsiders that they don't want. It's a vision of strengthening, consolidating the community's capacity as the purpose of these payment for environmental services, rather than simply paying opportunity costs, which may be relevant in the case of some of these private owners that Carlos was talking about. And you need regulatory systems that promote good behavior and discourage bad behavior. What we're seeing in Africa right now is the craziest thing in the world. We have charcoal as the main source of urban food cooking and much of the energy in the urban side. And yet so many of the countries have made this illegal or forced it into the informal sector, rather than developing a vision of how to get to sustainable charcoal production that could be actually a source of income and a source of incentives for people to increase the volume and the carbon and the capacity of their forests. To have regulatory systems that aren't there in theory, but that are actually moving in practice these processes towards a more sustainable and more equitable future. We have indigenous territories, constitutions in Latin America that recognize the plurinational, multicultural nature of the state, and yet they have the same forestry rules in an indigenous territory as in a mestizo territory, without any sense of the cultural differences, the local norms. We need regulatory systems that support these rights, not that undermine them. I think those are some of the keys for governments moving forward.
Thank you. Thank you so much, David. Very, very well said. Nonette, so from David, I would like to go to you, because David has laid down all the very important, I would say, changes that the government needs to make to happen. And you mentioned about this radical change. I just love this word, in Indonesia, talking about radical is, be careful talking about radical. So I like this word. So a question, actually, since I know the donors are also here as participants. Do you really believe that this radical change can actually also happen from the donor side or from the investors? Because we know that the changes are so fundamental, and it's also changing the paradigm of the donor itself, from short-term to long-term. And the long-term can be 20 years. It's not 5 years, 10 years, it can be 20 years. And then also the monitoring, evaluation, the system thinking, the transformational changes that needs to happen. Do you believe that can happen in the midst where our thinking is still the same? Our development paradigm is still the same. It's about growth. It's not about kindness or happiness. What do you think that needs to be radically changed to really achieve this change that we all want? Nonette.
You're asking a very difficult question, and there are many angles and ways of answering, but I'm speaking just from what I see and what we have experienced. What radical means really for me when I say that for development assistance and support is this ability to sort of really balance, what compliance that's really needed for this type of support and the results that the communities have been delivering for free, offering to the world essentially the guardianship of the last remaining forests, that the ancestral domains and all of these passed on traditional knowledge from generation to generation to this day, since the centuries, have been this co-dependence on nature. Therefore, you invest in your home in the way that we do personally feel individually to invest in ours, safe places. But these are no walls. These are with wild animals and trees. So the importance of that, looking at that, how do you translate that with development assistance as we have now? The systems, the plumbing, that we're facing that challenge, with no intention of and the really understanding beyond, the system, what the system provides, and what is out there. If we don't want to change indigenous peoples and make them become, office desk clerks, right? They're helping protect forests. They're risking their lives. They're going into the wild, monitoring all of that. They don't come home until 2-3 months for sometimes. So that's the kind of, how do we then structure that such that we are responsive to it? What is the system? Is it the UN system? Is it the tenure facility system? Which system? So that is for us radical. We're experimenting and we're learning as we go. But this plumbing is so and then that also, it's very unique, and it's and we're learning a lot. There are many, we're evolving some of these, but it cannot be marginal. Now is the time to really say, okay, let's make it frontline. The indigenous peoples, they're not asking very much, they're contributing a lot. Yeah, and they want, what's it? Is it education? Is it health? Is it this sense that they can protect, the way they do things and report back, and then the forest monitors are just going to tell, ask them what to do. What's the incentive? The incentives are a lot. They get now a chance to be, participants in the table, making priorities, for example, if they have proof that they are the ones that are in that area, guarding it. So then they can get some of these, results of land use planning, prioritization, the ability to say yes or no if there are projects that are not quite consistent with their values. This is really important, but it's not about against and with, it's not a fight. It's actually together. That's what I say, regenerative in that sense. It's a challenge because we have our own egos and institutional positions. Thank you. Yeah, don't get me going too much.
Thank you, Nonette. Rene, if I can ask a question to you on the issue of equity and inclusion. Rene, in your opinion, what, if any, are the power inequalities in forest governance that need to be changed to accommodate forest and land use sustainability? You are muted. We cannot hear you. You're still mute.
Okay, merci.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. Thank you for this question, a very relevant question. As far as I'm concerned, we need to involve beneficiaries and people who depend directly on the forest. We've seen many programs that were carried out, implemented. They are good programs. However, they are made in offices and they do not involve the people who are at the heart of it, i.e. indigenous people and people whose survival is based on the forest. We need to involve them from the design, but also in the implementation. As I said earlier, we have seen that many means were used. However, the means are generally kept between the partners and the administration and sometimes a few civil society actors, but we do not involve all of the stakeholders. We have national and international texts and documents which we use, and they talk about sustainable management of forest resources. However, the great difficulty is to know to which extent these texts are being used with the involvement of the impacted people, i.e. indigenous people. So the key to succeed in sustainable development and sustainable management of our forests is this. We need to take into account communities and we need to respect their rights. In the industry, we can see that often their rights are not taken into account. They're violated, and this leads to positive but also negative results. And in the DRC, this has been very clear, just like in the rest of the Congo Basin area. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Rene. I think we can start going into the question answer session because I see that there are quite a lot of questions from the audience. So let us start with that. I see that some has been answered also by our speakers, but hopefully, even though it has been answered, I would still like to call because some of these questions are very important and I think we all should hear the answer. So I would like to invite Tiago Valderes. Pacheco to open the mic and also to open the video if you would like to ask the question straight to David. Is it possible for him to open his mic? No. Okay. Well, let me read then, because this is very important question. Oh, Tiago, are you there?
Yes, Demi. Hi. How
Okay.
are you?
Yes. Oh, fine.
Yeah.
Thank you. Please ask your question so we can all hear.
It has been fascinating to hear the panel speaking, and I just wanted to double check if David would be able to give some practical examples of how we can actually tackle from a donor community some of these plumbing issues of the complexity of being able to genuinely support the grassroots movement that can create the incentives, the positive incentives that Carlos and Nonette have been so kindly giving practical examples. Yeah, that's it from my side. Thank you very much to everyone.
Thank you, Tiago. David, would you like to answer the question so we can all listen?
In terms of examples, I think we can think of both types of programs, but also types of practices. We have positive types of programs at every level. Nonette's tenure facility is one of the most important and one of the most promising. And the Niatero program is also very promising in terms of kind of NGO-led programs. As I mentioned, a number of the collective indigenous payments for environmental services programs in Latin America had much better results than I would have guessed, and really quite interesting in many cases. At the international level, you have Jeff's initial small grants program was path-breaking in many ways, but I think where Jeff is going now with the Inclusive Conservation Initiative is an interesting next step of that in terms of taking things to a different level and a different magnitude. The direct grant mechanisms at the World Bank. But one of the things that is key in terms of practices is lots of simple things like how do we move project proposals from having to be written down to it being possible for a project proposal to be a video, or for it to be possible for, instead of a long log frame or a complicated computer system, to get out to a community that has no electricity, that you find systems that will actually get out to the communities, that you deal with the question of receipts and accounts for areas where procurement policies are impossible, that have no banks, that have no multiple providers, that you rethink the question of hiring practices in clanic societies, that you don't push communities that have, because they are the way they are, have been able to successfully manage the forest to become something fundamentally different. I think the community managed funds that you see growing up in Brazil now, the Coiabes Fund in the indigenous side, the Mixeve Fund in terms of the Afro-descendant women involved in coconut breaking of Babasu coconuts, the Dema Fund in the Xingu, funds that are managed by the communities themselves with their own governance mechanisms. All of these, I think, give us a sense of where we need to go if we're serious about doing this.
Thank you. Thank you so much, David. So let me go next to the question that has not been answered. Yeah. So there's this one question from Mega from IPB. Mega, do you want to ask the question yourself? This is an open question, so anyone can answer this. Mega, would you like to open your mic? Or shall I read it for you? Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah,
All right.
okay.
Yeah, it's clear. So I just want to ask whether it is possible or not for us to actually shift our current set of ideology and paradigm to help address the inequalities, poverty, and any multiplied impacts due to the deforestation. And could you show me the best concrete recommendations, perhaps, to ensure that each country could follow the track and goals toward sustainable now and the future? So yeah, that's it from me. Thank you.
Thank you, Mega. Would anyone like to answer that? Maybe Carlos or Rene?
Pleasure to
Carlos,
do that. Well,
okay. Yes.
basically what my 4 points are aiming exactly to what Mega said, land tenure, rights, the market failure, the institutional failure, the good governance and corruptions are all the issues that will give us the condition for us to really understand that we may be able to revert and restore in terms of human well-being. But also, let me add something to what David was saying with regards to the reforms. I strongly believe that we need to if 80% of the tree deforestation land use change is generated through agriculture policies and investment, we got an issue within our agencies, the environmental agency and the agricultural agency. We don't confront that issue. What is the main difference within the Ministry of Agriculture and the Ministry of Environment? Well, people tend to say that agriculture is the productive ministry, environment is the conservation ministry. Wrong. That is not accurate. That is not correct. Both of them generate wealth. Both of them generate prosperity, jobs, and opportunities. The only difference that I see between them is that one works with domesticated biodiversity and the other works with wild biodiversity in the same landscapes with the same stakeholders, So why do we keep on having agencies that works on little pieces of the side of the landscape? And let me dig deeper. The rate of deforestation, I've done this exercise. So my conclusion is the rate of deforestation of the countries is closely related where the Forest Service is located. If it's located in the Ministry of Agriculture, most probably that the rate of deforestation in that country is higher than the rate of deforestation of the country that has the Forest Services in a Ministry of Environment. These are, low-hanging fruits from me, a politician, an environmental lawyer. These are the issues that we should be discussing right now. We will never, ever achieve any forest sustainability standard with the same thinking and with the same institutional approaches. So we need to really focus where we need to take, where we need to aim and address the issues. And yes, I put a lot of attention in those countries that has brought together agriculture and environment. There are like 8 to 10 countries that they brought them back. We need to remember, everybody, that the ministries of environment came, the National Park Service, Forest Service, and Wildlife Services, they came from the ministries of agriculture before we created ministries of environment in the late 1980s. So, why don't we begin thinking on agencies that work at the landscape level, at the seascape level, and begin breaking down those silos? Yes, we may fear a traditional minister of agriculture working on biodiversity. In Costa Rica, we brought environment and energy and mines, and we had that fear. And you know what we have today? We got twice the size of our forest, and 100% of our electricity is renewable. Why? Because we were able to begin changing the institutional setting. The institutional setting is the one that generates the policy for the private sector, generates the recognition for indigenous communities and local communities and farmers. So we need to address that issue up front.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Carlos. The next question is from Terry Slavin. Terry, are you there? Would you like to ask the question directly?
Yep, here I am, sorry. No, it's about the trees art standard and being used for the emergent jurisdictional RED platform. I'm just wondering, there's a lot of safeguards for Indigenous people and for land rights, and I wanted to know whether this is sufficient enough, and if I think there is probably some division within Indigenous groups on this issue.
Okay, maybe Nonette would like to answer that.
I do not know. I'm not the expert of the entire program of LEAF, but as far as it's relevant on the standards of Indigenous people's rights and environment, this is a very hopeful possibility of getting through art trees and ensuring, for example, that local governments and national governments could then access resources working with, and this is the key thing, working with the constituencies of Indigenous peoples and local communities protecting those forests at that jurisdiction. So if that was possible and that there's openness, and this is still really fresh and new, this initiative, it's not really been socialized yet to many, and there have been issues about the carbon rights, and that is being now monopolized as a result, and the valuation of carbon as well. But the principles that are put in place to make this initiative become unique or possibly unique, and the potentials of it is in the right place. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Nonette. Is anyone else wants to answer that? David, yes.
Yeah, I would just like to say a couple of things about that. The first is that safeguards are an absolute minimum. And LEAF the art standards do have some safeguards which on paper look reasonably good, but the safeguards are just about how do you avoid doing harm. The question is the LEAF initiative designed to do good when it comes to Indigenous peoples and local communities? And the answer is that it's designed in such a way that right now, Indigenous territories really cannot enter, they are jurisdictions, but they cannot really participate. They don't have 2.5 million hectares of forest, which is the minimal amount. I'm not sure all of Costa Rica has 2.5 million hectares of forest, much less an Indigenous territory. And so they're basically being excluded from participating. The vision of LEAF in terms of the way they look at high forest, low deforestation also tends to just exclude Indigenous peoples from participating because their forests have very limited deforestation, but are now under increasing threat. So I think we should see safeguards as the minimum that needs to happen, not what needs to happen. We need to have positive results, not just simply do no harm.
Mm-hmm. Very well said. Thank you, David. The next question is from Depi Susilawati. Question on about COVID, actually. What happens after COVID? Depi, are you there? Would you like to read your question?
Yes, I'm here. Thank you.
Okay.
So yeah, I'm just wondering to ask about what do you think about are we still having the same direction of sustainable forest management after the post-COVID-19 world? And how do you think the global forest governance in the future after that? Thank you.
Very important question. Maybe Rene, would you like to try to answer this post-COVID crisis and sustainable forest management? You're still muted. We cannot hear you. Rene? Yeah, okay.
It's a very good question. But I heard something about equity earlier on. I do want to talk about the RED standards. Regardless of the standards that you implement, before anything else, we must strengthen the communities to allow them to mobilize themselves. So sometimes these standards are good, but they don't take communities into account. Now, the question as it relates to COVID, indeed, at the moment, we see that with COVID, there is a diminishing of pressure on the forest sector. Activities have been slowed down. And I think this is a good opportunity to take stock and to regulate the sector. In the context of the Congo Basin, forestry activities have slowed down. But we haven't made the most of this downtime to figure out how we're going to manage the post-COVID period. There will be companies who will try to make up for lost time. And so the situation on the ground at the moment shows that there has been a significant decrease in logging activities, both artisanal and industrial. That is a good thing. Nevertheless, there may be a resumption that will have significant consequences.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much, Rene. Yeah, COVID is something that's it's still a moving target. Yeah. So let's see what's going to happen. Does anyone else want to add to that, or?
I can add a bit just on the level of resilience that Indigenous peoples and local communities have shown in COVID is really very significant. And this, despite the elders dying, the levels of vulnerability that they are each experiencing, depending on where they are in the regions. Asia, Latin America, and Africa, different. But the levels of resilience is very high. And we have to recognize that there are two ways by which governments have adapted to or used COVID. There's a rollback on some of the rights that had been there before, and the inability of people to move about in lockdowns has made that much more devastating. Yeah, in places where there's more cutting and just no licenses that are shown. And then on the other hand, it's what Rene had mentioned. There are places where there's slowdown. So we're being tested in many ways, and I think there is a lot still to learn from where we stand right now, and it hasn't stopped yet. It doesn't end it. So it's important for that also to be recognized. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Nonette. Okay, there's this very interesting question from Group B. I hope I didn't say the name wrong. Would you like to open your mic? Sorry. Group B? Or if not, maybe I can read. So early in 2021, the Russian government started walking back on forest governance, moving stewardship from the local, regional level to now a central, federal level. Other than centralizing sophisticated digital forest management and life mapping, employing a national grid and homogenizing the plumbing, can anyone on the panel comment how such a move would continue to present benefits to the grassroots forest governance, or would they consider this to be a step backwards? Thank you. Anyone would like to try that?
I can try. Yeah, yes. Just on the technology side, there is something that now is very fast. You have seen the advances in technology in mapping and boundary delineation, but our experience has shown, that if it is not ground truthed, and if the communities are not directly involved, that remains really vulnerable. It can only create more conflict. And in these places, it's important for us to really understand that ground truth information still holds and still remains in the hands of the local community groups that are positioned where the forests are, at this point. So it is important, yes, and it's a balance. There are ways by which we can use technology, and even in understanding how carbon payments can flow. directly to people who are guarding forests. There's potential there for technology, but the actual work and the real monitoring still is on the ground, very important, because there are cultural, traditional, other knowledges that can't be captured by these cameras moving around in our skies. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you, Nonette. Let me see, the next question. Okay, I heard that Carlos, you have to leave in 5 minutes. Oh, okay. Would you have, okay. Well, thank you so much. And if there is a comment, something that you would like to say to all of us, maybe as your last
yes,
comment?
of course. I want to share the sense of urgency. We don't have much time in front of us. We've been dealing with forest management for many, many years. We recognize challenges and gaps. This is a moment to do it. We at the Global Environment Facility are really committed to be able to provide funding to countries, and the GF is a political agreement within countries. But myself as the CEO, I'm very much open to the need to discuss how do we include non-state actors into the process. Even though we've been working for the last 30 years on a country-to-country basis, this is the moment that we may be able to open discussion for, in terms of our aspiration of higher impact, in terms of bringing all stakeholders into the process, because yes, of course, governments are in the center of the solutions, but are not the only ones there. And as we began the 8th replenishment process of the facility, we want to go from, the small grant program and the inclusive conservation initiative into larger approaches, so we can be able to support the government's commitment for sustainability. I never seen so much political willness as today. I never seen so much alignment within the political vision of our leaders with the scientific community as of today. Nevertheless, this requires different approaches and changing some ways of doing the conservation, the sustainability business. And I look forward to be, fully engaged on this. And I will finalize by saying, if we solve the rights and the land tenure issue, that will give us by far the biggest boost in our effort for sustainable landscape management that we haven't seen in our history. I saw it happening in my country, and I strongly believe that it can happen in many, many other places in the planet. So thank you so much for the possibility to join you all today.
Thank you so much, Carlos. Thank you for your time and your insight and for joining us. Have a good day.
Thanks.
Thank you. Okay, so let us continue again with the, we still have, only 10 minutes left. Oh my. Eric Kume. So why don't I just read the rest of the questions so that we can have more time. So this is from Eric. Thanks for the nice presentation. The bioeconomy is presented, primarily led by the EU, is seen as the future for green growth. How do we connect discussion on sustainable forest management into the bioeconomy, such that the latter does not become an approach for steamrolling community rights and resource substitution? Instead, a vision that unlocks finance for community forest management. Very good question. I open it to the floor. Who would like to answer that? Rene, Nonette, David. Steamrolling. Rene, did you?
Merci, c'est une question.
Thank you very much. It's a very interesting question because it places us back to the heart of the discussions that we had in many of the conversations we had about the climate. The Paris Agreement has brought us the NDCs. At the beginning, many countries took commitments And in the case of my country, our nationally determined contribution draws a link with bioeconomy because it focuses on 3 pillars: the forest sector, sustainably managed forest, and the energy sector. Because we need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by using fossil fuels less. And the other sector that Carlos mentioned a number of times is the agricultural sector. We need new practices, new ecological practices to ease the pressure on forests and to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And to answer the question, yes, it is possible, Eric, to combine both. We're trying to resolve the reduction of emissions, but we're trying to do this by improving practices. And that's why we have many third parties at the national and international level, but texts rather, we have many texts, and we need to apply these texts. For extractive industries, we need to use good practices. In Congo, we initiated RED standards for extractive industries. That's for mineral extraction and oil extraction in the forest sector. And we want to use practices to avoid contributing to deforestation. So for me, this link is paramount. Bioeconomy for reducing greenhouse gas emissions and reducing simultaneously deforestation, because as you know, deforestation represents almost 20% of greenhouse gas emissions. So it's a brilliant question, and I think it merits the attention of all partners who have pledged funding in the framework of the Global Environment Facility. But deforestation does not wait. Time is against us. We need to apply ourselves, and we need to apply all of these measures so that bioeconomy can work in concert with the sustainable management of our forests.
Okay, thank you so much, Rene. I will reserve the last 5 minutes for comments and closing statement from the speakers. But before that, I would like to ask one more question, because this is a very good question on corruption that actually Carlos brought up. So to all, how do you take into account the issue of corruption and lack of transparency in all those processes related to sustainable forest management? Corruption. Tough issue. Anyone would like to try to answer this? How do you take into account the issue of corruption and lack of transparency in the processes related to sustainable forest management? I can see Nonette smiling there. David, Nonette, any one of you would like to tackle this?
My only input here is that it is important from this perspective, at least from working with the sector I'm working with, to be able to address corruption at all levels. And this is essentially where laws and legislation and enforcement come into play, because where we are right now, our entry point is in ensuring that laws are implemented, for example, for rights. And when that happens, it opens this ability for other avenues to make accountable the governments that they work with. Yeah. And so when that happens, of course, for trees and forests and forest trade, there's a big pile of regulations on that at all, law enforcement and governance. And the entry point for indigenous peoples to come in is only in the fact that they are rights holders and that they can demand this. And that improves, again, it behooves on us to make sure that there's legality and legal empowerment, and those processes kick in. Yeah, because it's independent. When you have land rights, you also have your legal system, being put in place, and then the challenges there. The corruption that is really, for example, very very dominant that indigenous peoples are experiencing is when these licenses are passed and it is in their territories. right? And this is when it becomes, ultimately, it needs to be fought in court or physically stopped. And that endangers a lot of people. Yeah, and so that's there, and it's something that there are there are agencies that are assigned, and the Corruption Eradication Commission has a very important role in Indonesia, for example, for this, and in other countries there are those. But I think a big part of this work is in ensuring citizens ensure accountability and use the laws, because that is just where we need the work done. And it's mainly our partners now are implementing the laws on their land rights. They're not advocating. There are other sectors, other NGOs that are doing that. But it's an important area. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Rene, I see you raising hand. Did you want to say something, Rene?
Yes, because Nonette said most of it. However, I just wanted to come back to the issue of corruption, because this is the bone of contention with civil society. And civil society must be the whistleblower for violations. And the independent observation of forests must be one of the main conditions for donors, because when we don't have the expected results, often this is due to corruption. So we have minor and major corruption. The control in the forestry sector shows corruption that prevents communities to benefit from timber exploitation and timber logging. One of the solutions would be independent monitoring, but also forest certification. We have seen that in some areas where we demand forest certification, along with independent monitoring, we can have really good results, because corruption is really seen in forest areas and forest logging in the Congo Basin as a whole.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Rene. I think the time is up, so I would like to give the time to David, Nonette, and Rene a closing remark. If there's anything that you would like to say to the participants, please do. Let us start with David.
Yeah, I'll just, in a sense, repeat my message in terms of the fact that we need to have the people on the ground to make anything happen. It's not enough to do things in capital cities. It's not enough to do things in webinars. We need to have things happen on the ground, and the people who are on the ground are the communities, are the farmers, are the indigenous people, and they need our support. Just one thing that's interesting in terms of something that Carlos Manuel said is he's right that agricultural ministries have not had a good history when it comes to conservation. But what we're finding is incredible results when we're talking about getting farmer organizations involved in forest restoration, tree planting, agroforestry, tree crops, getting the trees on the landscape as part of people's livelihoods, part of their resilience, part of their coping solutions, really is a win-win solution for everybody. And I don't use that term very often. But I will say that it's an embarrassment that billions of dollars get spent each year, and that only a couple $100 million of those billions of dollars go to the people who are on the ground doing the work. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thanks so much, David. Nonette, closing statement for.
Yeah, just deep thanks for this opportunity, really, to have a conversation. I learned as much as I've shared. And just to emphasize that, yes, funding tenure and land tenure is so important. It enables space for different actors that are usually unusual to be talking, given the pressures of the forest. to be talking in this kind of regenerative quality where you either build or repair trust. And then from that, it's based on land use and land rights, and on existing legalities and customary practices. And in that, it opens the space, for better governance, better forest management, a strong sense of local ownership of the work. And it's really, that cannot be undervalued, and it just doesn't come naturally to people. Yeah, it's really important.
Okay, thank you. And lastly, Rene, closing statement for Vision 2030.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you so much. Earlier on, I heard that we had some donors who participate here. It is important to assess why, after all of these enormous amounts, of course, I'm talking about the Congo Basin, but they happen elsewhere, and we see that these funds do not reach the impacted areas. And of course, as Carlos said, corruption is the culprit here. So how can we reduce it? We cannot completely eliminate corruption, but we can reduce it. So we should have third-party independent monitoring from civil society, for example, but we need to build the resilience of civil society so that they can themselves protect these local and indigenous peoples. We need to also reinforce the state and the administration. We sometimes have the means, but we also have audits on the ground without which we do not reach any outcomes. When we talk about carbon sequestration and protection against climate change and the different threats, well, deforestation is forever increasing despite all the resources. So we need to include all the impacted communities, because they have shown us that for many times they have managed to manage their forests themselves. I was delighted to take part in this forum. I have learned a lot from experiences of all of my colleagues here. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rene. So, ladies and gentlemen, participants and dear speakers, it's been a wonderful 1.5 hours, learning so much from the presentation and also the question. So I would like to thank the speakers here, Rene, Nonette, and also David and Carlos, and also thanking Chatham House for making this happen. And of course, the participants who are here and asking very, very good, tough question that makes all of us think very hard. And I'm sure there are many more ideas coming out from this session. So Vision 2030, we've heard together tonight how local community, indigenous community is the root of all the sustainability of the world. So we need to really focus on how is it that we can build a resilient indigenous local community with a clean government, of course. Clean government, that is a challenge for all of us. So with that, I would like to thank all of you. Thank you again for participating, and keep safe, stay healthy, and see you sometime in cyberspace. Thank you.
Thank you.